I remember the exact moment the sky learned a new color. It was not night, not storm, not eclipse. It was a bruise spreading across the upper atmosphere, a slow darkening that did not obey the rules we had been taught since childhood. I was on my way to my shift, boots echoing in a transit concourse that smelled of machine oil and recirculated breath, when the lumen panels flickered and died for half a second too long. People froze. You learn to respect flickers on an imperial world. Flickers mean attention. Then the sirens began. They were not the civil defense sirens we practiced for. Those had a steady rhythm, a reassurance baked into their tone. These were higher, more frantic, layered over one another as if several incompatible alerts had been activated at once. Vox speakers crackled alive along the concourse walls, spitting static before settling into the measured, sanctified voice of the administratum. Citizens are advised to remain calm. Temporary astropathic disruption has been detected. Compliance audits are underway. The words were familiar, comfortingly bureaucratic. They meant nothing, and that was their purpose. I looked up through the transparisteel canopy and saw shapes moving where there should have been only cloud and distant void, long silhouettes, angular and wrong, sliding across the sky with predatory patience. The sun dimmed behind them, not blocked so much as diminished, as if its authority had been questioned and found lacking. Around me, people did what we had been trained to do all our lives. They waited, not because they trusted the message, but because the message was law. You do not run until you are told to run. You do not panic until panic is authorized. We stood beneath screaming sirens and watched the sky bruise, while servo skulls drifted overhead, projecting parchment notices that unfurled mid-air with seals already stamped. Remain at your assigned locations. Further instruction pending. Faith ensures continuity. I read each one as it floated past, the thin paper fluttering in artificial wind, the ink still wet. My hands trembled, but I folded them behind my back, the posture of obedience drilled into me since infancy. Belief was mandatory. Doubt was heresy. And if the administratum said this was temporary, then temporary it would be, until it wasn't. The screams started shortly after. At first they were distant, barely audible beneath the sirens and the low rumble of traffic grinding to a halt. A single cry, cut short. Then another, closer. People shifted uneasily, heads turning, trying to locate the sound without appearing alarmed. I told myself it was an accident. A tram malfunction, a panic response from someone untrained. The Vox speakers spoke again. Unscheduled disturbances are being addressed. Remain compliant. The word disturbances was repeated twice, as if emphasis might turn terror into a clerical error. I remember the smell next. Ozone, sharp and metallic, drifting through the concourse vents. It did not belong there. Our air was usually stale but predictable, sweat lubricant, incense residue from the shrine at the transit hub's center. This was different. This smelled like machinery pushed beyond safety margins, like weapons discharging somewhere nearby. A man near me, an off-shift dock laborer by his patches, whispered a prayer under his breath. His lips moved quickly, eyes darting toward the exits. I wanted to join him, but my mouth felt dry, my tongue thick. The pressure in the air was building, not physically, but socially, like the moment before a riot or a stampede, when everyone knows movement is coming but no one wants to be first. Above us, the sky cracked, not with thunder, but with light. A spear of fire stabbed downward somewhere beyond the hab spires, followed by a shockwave that rattled the concourse floor and sent loose debris skittering. The sirens shifted pitch, overlapping themselves in a way that made my teeth ache. Still, the administratum spoke. Localized atmospheric entry detected. Civil defense forces are mobilizing. All citizens are reminded that order is protection. I believed them. I believed them because I had no alternative that did not involve terror so vast I could not fit it inside my skull. Belief was easier. Belief was safer. Belief had kept our world productive for generations. More screams now, unmistakable, echoing through access tunnels and up ventilation shafts. They were not the screams of panic or injury. They were elongated, shaped, as if whoever was making them had been given time to understand what was happening and found no words sufficient. Someone ran. Just one woman, breaking from the crowd toward an emergency stairwell. The moment she moved, a shock mall crackled to life. An enforcer stepped out from behind a pillar, his helmet impassive, and struck her down with practiced efficiency. She collapsed bunlessly to the floor, twitching. "Remain at your assigned locations." The vox intoned again, louder now, layered with a faint echo that suggested multiple transmission points had been activated. No one else ran. I stared at the fallen woman, at the way her fingers twitched against the cold floor, and understood something essential. Whatever was coming was worse than the punishment for disobedience. The Imperium relies on that understanding. It cultivates it. The sky darkened further as more silhouettes descended, their passage leaving contrails of smoke and fire. From somewhere far above, I thought I heard laughter carried on amplified vox, deep, distorted, wrong. It might have been my imagination. It might not have been. The parchment notices kept coming, fluttering down like dead leaves. Do not congregate. Await further instruction. Faith in procedure is faith in survival. Then the screaming reached the concourse itself. A side door burst open, and a security clerk staggered through, blood soaking the front of his uniform. His eyes were wide, unfocused, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He tried to speak. Instead, he collapsed, leaving a smear of red across the polished floor. Behind him, the corridor was dark, too dark. Something moved in that darkness, tall and angular, its outline briefly illuminated by the flicker of failing lumen strips. I did not see details. I did not need to. The shape was enough. The way it moved, unhurried, deliberate, carried a promise my body understood even if my mind refused to. The vox speakers fell silent, not a clean shutdown. They crackled, spat static, and died mid-syllable. The sirens followed a heartbeat later, cutting off as if someone had reached out and strangled them. The sudden quiet was worse than the noise. In that silence, I heard the city die by inches, distant impacts, structural groans, more screams closer now, layered and overlapping. Someone began sobbing openly. Someone else vomited. I stood frozen. My hands clenched so tight my nails bit into my palms, and waited for instruction that would never come. That was the moment belief broke. Not shattered. Belief is too resilient for that, but cracked, enough to let something cold seep in. I realized then that the compliance notice had not been reassurance. It had been an obituary, read aloud before the death had fully occurred. And as the darkness advanced down the concourse, step by measured step, I understood the final truth of that day. The messages were no longer keeping pace with reality. The screams were faster. The first killings were not chaotic. That was the second lie I had to unlearn, that invasion looks like disorder, that enemies arrive as storms. What came through the concourse did not behave like an uncontrolled force. It moved like a bureaucrat with a quota. It took its time. It chose. It made examples as if examples were a currency it intended to spend carefully. When the tall shape stepped into the failing light, the crowd did what crowds always do when their training collapses and instinct returns. It surged. People shoved. Shoes scraped. Someone fell and was trampled. I felt a shoulder slam into my ribs and tasted breath that was not mine, hot, stale, tinged with fear, sweat. Before I was carried toward an access corridor, I had no intention of entering. The corridor door had been locked by emergency protocol, of course. All exits except authorized routes sealed, all movement restricted to maintain order. That was what the red warning glyph above the door insisted, blinking patiently as fists pounded the frame. The lock did not care. Locks never care. They are the purest expression of imperial faith, a mechanism that assumes compliance and punishes deviation. Behind us, the darkness advanced, not just the absence of light. An active pressure that seemed to make the air heavier, colder. I smelled it as it came, a scent like burnt copper and old leather, like incense left too long in a shrine until it curdles. Under it was something sharper, chemical, like the bite of ozone after a weapon discharge. Then a voice rolled across the concourse, amplified and resonant, shaped by vox grilles in a helm or a throat augmetic. It was not an announcement. It was not a command in any language my schooling had taught me. It was laughter turned into sound, rich, low, savoring. People screamed again, but differently now. No longer the distant, confused cries from earlier. These were immediate, animal, the sound a body makes when it recognizes a predator. I did not see the first death clearly. I heard it, a wet tearing sound followed by a gurgle, then silence where a voice had been. The crowd shuddered as if a single spine ran through all of us. Someone near the front of the throng tried to climb over others toward the locked door, fingers scrabbling at shoulders and hair. Another person bit him in panic, teeth sinking into flesh. In the press, morality evaporates. Procedure evaporates. Only breath remains, and the fight to keep it. The concourse lumen panels flickered again, catching the invaders in brief, stuttering frames, armored figures, tall. Their plates were dark, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, but edged with pale markings that looked like crude lightning. They moved in pairs, not rushing. One would step forward, stop, tilt its helm as if listening. The other would drift aside, flanking, herding, like hunters, no, like administrators of fear. One of them reached down and seized a man by the collar. The man's feet kicked uselessly as he was lifted clear off the ground. The armored figure held him up, almost gently, turning him as if inspecting a product. The man babbled, voice breaking. "Please, by the throne, please, I'm compliant." The invader's helm inclined, as if acknowledging the plea, and then the man was opened. Not stabbed in a quick, efficient way, but drawn apart. The sound was obscene, flesh-giving, bone-resisting, then snapping. Blood sprayed in a hot arc across the polished floor. The armored figure held the man's body for a moment longer, letting the crowd see, letting us understand. Then it dropped the remains and moved on. That was when I realized the pattern. They were not killing everyone. They were selecting. The crowd broke in multiple directions at once, people scattering into side corridors, maintenance tunnels, anywhere that might promise concealment. I ran too, not because I believed escape was possible, but because standing still felt like volunteering. My lungs burned as I pushed through a side hatch into a service passage that smelled of damp insulation and coolant leaks. Behind me, alarms began to wail again. Different ones, harsher, the kind reserved for structural breach and contamination. Over them, Vox speakers crackled back to life, but not with the administratum's measured assurances. These were fragmented, panicked transmissions, overlapping, half-censored. Unknown hostile, where civilians remain, by order of static. Sector lockdown. The bureaucracy was attempting to catch up. It never does. I ran until my legs shook. Until the service passage opened into a narrow stairwell. I climbed, boots slipping on metal steps slick with condensation. Above me I could hear the city, distant impacts, the roar of engines, the constant, rising chorus of human voices breaking under fear. When I emerged at street level, the air hit like a slap. Hive air is always filthy, smoke, exhaust, sweat, but now it carried something new, ash, and the faint sweetness of burning plastic. The sky above was filled with dark shapes moving between the spires, their engines leaving trails like scars. Searchlights swept across the hab stacks, not to find threats to eliminate, but to illuminate targets for spectacle. I ducked into the shadow of a shrine kiosk, pressing myself against its cold stone. The kiosk's relief carvings depicted saints and martyrs, faces serene as they endured torment. Someone had splashed devotional oil on the carvings earlier. Now it mixed with grime and ran in thin streams down the stone. A patrol of local enforcers marched past, 8 men in flak coats, visors down, shock, mauls raised. They looked absurdly fragile against the scale of what was descending. Their leader barked orders into a hand, Vox, voice trembling with forced authority. "All citizens return to hab units. Curfew will be enforced. Non-compliance will be punished." Even as he spoke, a shadow fell over them. It was so sudden the enforcers did not have time to react. One looked up, visor reflecting a shape dropping from above like a falling statue. The armored invader landed among them with a crunch that made my stomach lurch. Someone's spine, maybe, or just the pavement. The enforcers swung their mauls, crackling arcs of energy snapping at dark armor. It did nothing. The invader moved with a terrible economy. A backhand, and an enforcer's head snapped sideways at an angle no living neck tolerates. A grab, and another was lifted, slammed into the wall hard enough to leave a wet imprint. The remaining enforcers broke, scattering, but the invader did not chase them. It let them run. Then another armored figure stepped into view, carrying something in its gauntlet, a data slate. I saw the dull screen glow briefly in its hand. The invader tilted its helm toward it, as if reading. Then it looked down the street, directly toward a hab, block across the avenue, its entrances sealed with official warning tape and purity seals. It walked there, not hurried, not triumphant, purposeful. That was the moment the thought struck me cold, nauseating clarity. They had our records, our census data, our registries, our names. Darkness had learned our names, and it intended to use them. I followed at a distance, because fear makes you stupid in specific ways. It makes you watch what will kill you, because knowledge feels like protection. I kept to shadows, slipping behind broken vendor stalls and stacks of ration crates, my breath shallow. The hab block doors were still sealed when the invaders arrived. A parchment notice fluttered on the entry, stamped with the administratum seal, "Remain within. Await instruction." The invader reached out and tore the notice away with 2 fingers, as if removing a cobweb. It read whatever was beneath, an identification plate listing block designation, occupancy numbers, maintenance records. A tidy summary of human lives reduced to logistics. Then it knocked. One slow, deliberate knock, like a polite visitor. From inside, I heard muffled voices, panic, a child crying. Someone praying loudly enough for the words to bleed through the plasteel. The invader knocked again. This time, the door buckled inward as if struck by a siege ram. The invaders entered. I did not follow them inside. I stayed outside, pressed against the wall, listening. At first there was only shouting, then the sound of furniture being overturned, then a scream that cut off sharply, then another, then a wet, rhythmic sound, like skin being peeled from something that still lived. It went on longer than it needed to. That was the point. When the invaders emerged, they carried something between them. At first I thought it was a bundle of fabric. Then it shifted, limp and heavy, and I recognized a human form. Not dead. Still twitching, still making faint sounds, but opened, flensed, its skin hanging in strips. They hung it on the hab, block's outer railing with cable hooks, arranging it with care, like an artist positioning a centerpiece. Then they left, moving on to the next block, leaving the rest of the district untouched. One family, flayed, displayed as a lesson written in flesh. Above, on a balcony 2 levels up, I saw officials, administratum clerks in red, trimmed robes, flanked by armed attendants, arguing furiously. They waved documents, pointed at the street, screamed over each other about jurisdiction, about authority, about which department was responsible for emergency response. Below them, blood ran into the gutters in thin rivulets, steaming slightly in the cold air. The officials did not come down. They did not help. They continued to debate, and that was when the final realization of that cycle settled into my bones, heavier than fear. The invaders were not rushing because they did not need to. They were not here to conquer territory in the old sense. They were here to convert our order into terror, to make the city itself into an amplifier for despair. Terror was the invasion force, and it was already working. The curfew was announced 3 times before anyone understood it was real. The first broadcast came through the hab, block vox at an odd hour, the kind usually reserved for shift changes or devotional reminders. The voice was calm, rehearsed, filtered through layers of static and sensor, bleeped delays. It declared an immediate restriction on movement, citing ongoing security operations, and the necessity of civic cooperation. We were instructed to remain inside our dwellings until further notice. Non-compliance, the voice added gently, would be punished. The second broadcast added details. All transit was suspended, all commerce halted, all unauthorized presence in public spaces would be treated as hostile activity. The penalties were not specified, but the silence where specifics should have been felt heavier than any threat. We had already seen enough to imagine the rest. The third broadcast was not from the administratum. It was layered over their message, overriding it in places, bleeding through the vox speakers with a distortion that made my skull ache. A deep, modulated voice rolled through the hab, stretched and amplified until it seemed to vibrate inside my chest. "Stay inside," it said, mockingly echoing the official order. "Hide well. We will come to you." The vox speakers died immediately after. The curfew was etched not in law, but in absence. Outside my hab unit, the corridor lights dimmed to emergency levels, casting everything in red and amber. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. Neighbors packed into their units, doors sealed. Prayers murmured through thin walls. I sat on my cot, back against the plasteel frame, listening to the city through layers of insulation. Armored footsteps passed periodically in the streets below, not the hurried march of enforcers, but a slower, heavier tread. Each step was deliberate, measured, as if the street itself were being counted. Sometimes there were voices, amplified and distorted, broadcasting threats that sounded almost like sermons. Obedience delays suffering. Noise invites correction. Fear is proof of life. The words echoed off the hab stacks, bouncing and overlapping until it was impossible to tell where one voice ended and another began. They were not instructions meant to be followed. They were reminders meant to be absorbed. Every hour, the administratum attempted to reassert itself. New laws were broadcast with ritual regularity, each one more restrictive than the last. Water rationing adjusted, power usage curtailed. Unauthorized prayer declared a disruption risk. The rules stacked on top of one another like badly fitted armor, impressive on paper and useless in practice. No one enforced them. Not because enforcement was impossible, but because enforcement had become irrelevant. Safety had evaporated, and without safety, law becomes theater. We listened to the broadcasts out of habit, out of conditioning, but they no longer provided guidance. They were relics of a world that had already ended. I learned the new rhythm of survival quickly. Do not use lights after the second watch. Do not speak above a whisper. Do not look out the window unless you must, and if you must, do it briefly. The invaders liked windows. They liked silhouettes. They liked the moment when curiosity overcame caution. Across the narrow gap between hab stacks, I watched one of my neighbors disappear. He lived 3 levels above me. A maintenance clerk I recognized by his habit of humming while he worked. I saw him at his window, curtain drawn back just enough to peer into the street. His face was pale, eyes wide, mouth moving in silent prayer. A shape detached itself from the darkness below. It climbed the hab wall without urgency, armored fingers finding purchase in seams and decorative recesses. It moved like gravity made flesh, inevitable and uninterested in haste. The clerk saw it at the last second. His mouth opened. There was a flash of movement, a blur of dark armor, and then the window shattered inward. The clerk vanished from view. The curtain fluttered torn, then stilled. No scream. That was worse. The broadcasts continued. Unauthorized movement detected in Sector 9. Corrective action in progress. Remain compliant. I began to mark time by absences. The hab unit across the corridor fell silent first. A family of 4, I think. I had heard their children crying earlier, the sound carrying through the thin walls. After the 3rd cycle there was nothing, no movement, no voices. The door remained sealed, the purity seal unbroken, as if whatever had taken them had passed through walls rather than entrances. Further down the corridor, an elderly woman tried to leave. She had lived alone as long as I could remember, her unit filled with devotional icons and the smell of old incense. She shuffled into the corridor clutching a ration tin, muttering about water shortages, about the rules being unclear. She did not make it 10 steps. The lights flickered. A shadow fell. I heard a wet crack, like a bundle of sticks snapping. Her ration tin rolled across the floor, dented, spilling dry protein pellets that scattered uselessly. No one came out to collect her. No one spoke her name. By the next cycle, the corridor servitors had scrubbed the floor clean. The curfew held. Not because we obeyed, but because we learned that movement equaled visibility, and visibility equaled selection. Survival became a crime of chance, a lottery where the only winning strategy was to be uninteresting. Sometimes the invaders broadcast names. That was the worst part. They would walk the streets and call out, their amplified voices reading from data slates, each name pronounced carefully, reverently, as if reciting a roll of honor. When a name was called, there was a pause, a silence heavy with expectation. If the person answered, they died quickly. If they did not, the invaders would wait. They were patient. They would begin to describe the person instead: occupation, family status, registered dwelling, proof that hiding was temporary, that records were more durable than walls. I heard my own name once, not shouted, not threatened, simply spoken, drifting through the night air, wrapped in static and amusement. I pressed myself flat against the floor, heart pounding so hard I feared it would give me away. I did not breathe until the voice moved on. I do not know why I was spared chance, perhaps, or oversight, or a calculation I could not see. Days blurred together under the curfew. Sleep came in shallow fragments, broken by distant screams or the sudden thump of something heavy landing nearby. Food ran low, water rationing failed entirely. We drank recycled condensation and prayed our stomachs would accept it. The administratum continued to issue laws. They became increasingly abstract, increasingly detached from reality. Decrees about productivity targets, reminders of tithers owed, instructions to attend shrines that no longer existed. It was as if the machinery of governance had no sensory input, only momentum. Outside, armored shapes stalked the streets, their presence constant, their voices echoing from amplifiers that turned threats into liturgy. They spoke of fear as a resource, of obedience as delay, of suffering as inevitable. Inside, we listened to our neighbors vanish one by one, their removal announced only by silence. I learned then that curfews are not about control. They are about isolation. They make each dwelling a cell, each survivor a solitary witness. They prevent collective panic by ensuring panic is experienced alone, in the dark, with no one to confirm that what you hear is real. The curfew was etched in bone, not because it was enforced with violence, though it was, but because it rewrote our instincts. It taught us to be still while horror moved freely. It taught us that survival required shrinking, erasing ourselves until we were barely present. And as the days passed, as the city learned to hold its breath indefinitely, I understood the cruel genius of it. A world that does not move cannot fight back. They did not call it a roundup. That word implies disorder, shouting, force applied indiscriminately. What came instead was quieter, cleaner, and far more deliberate. It began with notices, real ones this time, not fluttering parchment or broken vox threats. Hard copy manifests appeared on hab doors, printed on thick paper stamped with seals so official they felt obscene in the aftermath of so much failure. Census verification required. Remain available for processing. Known appearance will be corrected. The Imperium had found its footing again, or at least the shape of it. Even as terror ruled the streets, bureaucracy reasserted itself, because bureaucracy is harder to kill than people. I found my name on the list outside my unit on the second cycle after the curfews tightened. Seeing it there felt surreal, like encountering my own reflection in a place mirrors should not exist. Full designation, hab address, occupation code, every detail precise, pulled from archives that had survived orbital fire and institutional collapse alike. They knew exactly where I lived. The harvest began at dawn, though dawn meant little under a sky perpetually bruised by smoke and shadow. Doors were opened not by rams or explosives, but by access codes overridden with chilling efficiency. The locks sang briefly then surrendered. No alarms, no warning, just the soft click of compliance betrayed. Armored figures moved through the habs in pairs, accompanied by robed clerks carrying data slates. The contrast was grotesque, instruments of terror flanking instruments of order, working in perfect coordination. The clerks pointed. The armored figures acted. People were taken quietly, not dragged, at least not at first. Families were instructed to step into the corridor, to present identification, to stand in marked lines painted hastily onto the floor with luminescent paste. The paste glowed faintly under emergency lighting, outlining where to stand, where not to move. Even now, even here, the Imperium loved its lines. I stood between a factorum worker and a woman clutching a child too tightly, her fingers digging into the fabric of his coat. The child did not cry. He had learned, as we all had, that noise shortened life. A clerk walked the line, slate humming softly. He stopped in front of each person, glanced at the screen, then marked something with a stylus. Sometimes he nodded. Sometimes he shook his head. The meaning of either gesture was not explained. Those who received a nod were escorted away by enforcers, Imperial enforcers, not the invaders, toward transport marked with the Aquila. Labor details, we assumed. Penal service, something survivable at least temporarily. Those who received a shake of the head were handed over to the armored figures. I watched the worker beside me receive the nod. Relief flooded his face so suddenly it looked like pain. He did not look back as he was led away. The woman with the child received the shake. She did not scream. She simply tightened her grip as if holding harder might anchor the child to reality. The armored figure reached out, gently prying her fingers loose one by one. The child was taken first. The woman followed, her face empty now, her will already spent. I did not see where they went, I smelled it instead. Fear has a smell, acrid sour, but what drifted back from whatever processing point lay beyond the corridor was worse. Waste, blood, burned hair, the unmistakable copper sweet tang of exposed flesh. The corridor ventilation struggled, whining softly as it tried and failed to scrub the air clean. When my turn came, the clerk paused longer than the others. He frowned at his slate, then tapped it twice, as if refreshing data. His stylus hovered. For a moment, absurd hope flickered in my chest. Then he shook his head. I was tagged, not with a mark on my body, but with a strip of plastic pressed to my collar, warm from the printer. It bore a simple symbol, an inverted triangle, and a number. No explanation. None was needed. We were marched through the hab corridors, down stairwells slick with condensation and old blood, into the open streets. The city looked curated. Entire blocks were untouched, their windows dark, their inhabitants locked inside to listen. Other blocks were lit harshly, floodlights illuminating makeshift processing zones, ringed with razor wire and purity seals. Servo skulls hovered overhead, recording everything from multiple angles. I realized then that this was not just collection. It was documentation. We were herded into lines that stretched down the avenue, dozens of us at a time. Workers, clerks, children old enough to stand on their own. No attempt was made to separate by age or skill. The only distinction was the symbol on the plastic strip. The armored figures walked along the line slowly, studying us. Occasionally, one would stop and tilt its helm toward a person, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Sometimes, after this pause, the person was pulled from the line and taken away alone. Those people did not return. At the end of the line stood a raised platform. On it were devices I did not recognize, but whose purpose was immediately obvious. Vox casters, recording arrays, amplifiers tuned not for clarity but for reach. The first demonstration began without announcement. A man was brought forward, middle-aged, wearing the patched uniform of a data archive clerk. He was shaking so badly he could barely stand. An armored figure forced him to his knees, holding him upright by the hair. A voice boomed from the amplifiers, distorted but clear enough to carry across the district. Observe. What followed was not execution. It was instruction. The man was hurt slowly, methodically. Not enough to kill him. Enough to teach. His screams were captured, filtered, replayed with slight delays so they overlapped with themselves, creating a chorus of agony that filled the street. The amplifiers carried the sound everywhere, into hab units, into sealed rooms, into ears pressed desperately against walls. When the man finally died, slumping forward in a wet heap, the recording did not stop. It looped, his final screams repeating even as his body lay still. Lesson complete. The voice announced. The line shuffled forward. That was when I understood my designation. We were not being harvested for labor. We were being harvested for spectacle. Each of us was a data point, a potential broadcast, a variable in an experiment designed to refine terror into its most efficient form. The Imperium had failed to protect us, but its records, its precious records, had been repurposed with flawless accuracy. I was processed quickly. A clerk scanned my plastic strip, nodded once, and gestured me toward a holding pen rather than the platform. Relief surged through me, immediately followed by guilt so sharp it felt like nausea. Around me, others were not so fortunate. The screams began again, layered and amplified, and I learned to dissociate, to retreat inward, to become small inside my own skull. As night fell, the broadcasts continued, screams replayed as warnings, as entertainment, as compliance tools. Somewhere officials were still filing reports, still debating authority, still stamping forms to retroactively justify what was happening. Somewhere, the Imperium was telling itself that this was being managed. Standing in that pen, surrounded by the unchosen, the unuseful, the unnecessary, I finally accepted the truth we had all been avoiding. The harvest was not about numbers. It was about teaching the survivors what they were worth. And the lesson was being written in us. The city did not die. That was the cruelest part. It continued, lights on, power flowing, manufacturum stacks still coughing smoke into the bruised sky. Transit rails hummed empty. Vox towers broadcast on schedule. Shrines rang their bells at prescribed hours. From orbit, I am certain we looked intact, productive, compliant. A functioning asset. The Imperium prefers its tragedies neat, its losses folded into acceptable margins. But inside, the city learned to whimper. Whole districts were left standing after the harvest, their structures untouched, their infrastructure preserved with almost loving care. The people inside them, however, were reduced, pared down to trembling remnants who understood, with animal clarity, that survival now depended on reaction rather than action. We were allowed to live only if we responded correctly to what came next. And there was always a next. Each night, the broadcasts began. Not official announcements, those had faded into irrelevance, but curated transmissions injected directly into the Vox network. The signal overrode local controls effortlessly, sliding into every speaker, every personal receiver, every public address system. There was no way to shut it off without shutting yourself off from the world entirely. The voice that introduced the broadcasts was calm, amused, citizens. It would begin drawn out, savoring the word. Tonight's correction has been selected for instructional value. Then the screams would play, not new ones. Never new ones. Always recordings, filtered, enhanced, replayed from multiple angles. The sound quality was immaculate. You could hear breath hitch, vocal cords tear, bones crack under pressure. Sometimes the feed cut to visual, projected onto hab walls and shrine facades alike, forcing images into places once reserved for saints and scripture. The victims were named. Sometimes they were people I knew, a woman from my shift rotation, a boy who used to run messages between hab blocks, a clerk from the ration office who had once slipped me an extra protein strip when the count came up short. Their names were spoken clearly, reverently, as if honoring their contribution. This is what happens, the voice would say, when compliance ends. We learned quickly what not to do. Do not cry loudly when the broadcast begins. The sound carries. Do not turn away from the wall if images are shown, movement can be misinterpreted. Do not pray aloud unless the prayer matches approved liturgies. Improvisation invites curiosity. The city's remaining population adapted with horrifying speed. Windows were boarded from the inside, leaving only narrow slits for observation. Furniture was rearranged to create shadowed corners where families huddled together, breath shallow, bodies pressed close. Children were taught games of silence. How long can you stay still? How softly can you breathe? How small can you make yourself? I measured time by breakdowns. The man in the unit below mine lasted 4 nights. I heard him pacing during the broadcasts, muttering to himself, arguing with voices only he could hear. On the 5th night, when the screams reached a particularly high pitch, he snapped. He ran into the street, screaming defiance, arms wide as if daring the darkness to take him. It did. The broadcast the next night included his voice. That was how we learned hope was dangerous. Hope made you visible. Hope made you loud. Hope convinced you that reaction could become resistance, that running might change the outcome. The city punished hope swiftly, efficiently, turning it into another lesson for those who remained. Some people tried faith instead. Shrines overflowed at first, candles burning low as people crowded into sacred spaces, clinging to ritual like a flotation device. The invaders allowed this for a time. Then one night, the broadcast cut to a shrine interior, a packed hall, chanting echoing off stone walls. The recording showed armored figures walking calmly down the central aisle as the faithful scattered in panic. The screams that followed were layered with hymns, prayers dissolving into terror. After that, the shrines emptied. Silence became the only reliable devotion. The broadcasts grew more elaborate over time. They began to include commentary, observations about how long it took a victim to break, which methods produced the most sustained vocalization, how different demographics responded to pain. Charts were displayed briefly between segments, data overlays translating suffering into metrics. I recognized the format, administratum reporting. Someone somewhere was filing these as instructional material. Terror, refined and optimized, presented as a case study. During the days, if they can be called days, we ventured out only when necessary. Ration distribution resumed under heavy supervision, lines forming in absolute silence, eyes downcast. Armored figures watched from rooftops and balconies, motionless, their presence enough to enforce order. No one spoke unless spoken to. No one lingered. I remember standing in one of those ration lines, hands shaking as I presented my identification chit. The clerk behind the counter was pale, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion. He scanned my chit, hesitated, then handed me my allotment without meeting my gaze. Behind me, someone sobbed softly. The sob was cut off abruptly. No one turned around. At night, the city listened to itself suffer. The acoustics of a hive are strange. Sound travels in unpredictable ways, echoing through ducts and service shafts, surfacing far from its origin. A scream from one district might be heard faintly in another, distorted but recognizable. We learned to catalog them subconsciously, to recognize patterns, to guess where the next demonstration would occur based on which areas had been quiet longest. Quiet was a warning. I began to dread the absence of broadcasts more than their presence. Silence meant preparation, selection, something new being arranged. Once, there was a gap. An entire night without a transmission. People whispered about it the next morning, cautiously, as if even speculation might be overheard. Perhaps it was over. Perhaps reinforcements were coming. Perhaps the invaders had moved on. That evening, the broadcast returned. It featured multiple feeds at once. Screams overlapped, layered into a cacophony that filled the city, amplified to maximum output. The voice spoke over it, louder than ever. Correction delayed. It said pleasantly. Correction intensified. After that, no one hoped again. The city learned to whimper because whimpering did not attract attention. It learned to exist in a state of perpetual anticipation, muscles tense, minds fraying, always waiting for the next atrocity to define the limits of survival. We were not conquered. We were conditioned. And as the nights piled up, as the broadcasts continued to carve lessons into our nerves, I understood the true shape of what was happening. They were not destroying the city. They were teaching it how to fear correctly. The announcement of liberation arrived with fanfare. Orbital vox bursts cut through the night, overriding the invaders' broadcasts with triumphant static and layered hymns. Sirens wailed again, this time in regulated patterns that meant order restored. The administratum's voice returned, steadier now, reinforced by martial cadence and clipped authority. Imperial forces have engaged the enemy. Remain in place. Victory is assured. I did not cheer. No one I knew did. We had learned the cost of believing messages that arrived too late. The fighting, when it came, was distant. Not the thunder of a righteous counter-assault sweeping through the streets, but isolated detonations, sharp exchanges of fire that echoed briefly, and then vanished. From my window slit I saw contrails streak across the sky, interceptor craft dueling shadows that slipped away rather than stood their ground. The invaders did not contest the city openly. They withdrew, like predators finished with a feeding ground. The broadcast stopped, all of them. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there were no screams piped into our dwellings. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the ringing emptiness left after a noise too loud for too long. Imperial boots entered the streets at dawn, real boots this time, standard issue, scuffed, familiar in their weight and sound. Guardsmen moved in cautious formations, weapons raised, eyes scanning every shadow. They looked exhausted, weary and far too late. Their armor bore fresh scorch marks. Their banners were crisp, newly unfurled, as if ceremony might erase the stench still clinging to the air. People emerged slowly, blinking in the harsh daylight, faces pale and hollow. We did not rush the soldiers. We did not embrace them. We watched, measuring, waiting to see if this was another performance. A loudhailer crackled. "Citizens, the enemy has been driven off!" This world stands secure under the Imperium once more. Secure. The word landed badly. The soldiers began their sweeps, not to help, but to assess. Medicae units followed, tagging bodies, spraying neutralizers over bloodstains, cataloging damage. Clerks came too, carrying slates already loaded with forms. The machine of reclamation spun up instantly, grinding forward as if it had never stalled. Mass graves were discovered, or rather, acknowledged. The soldiers stepped around them, marking coordinates, placing temporary icons to indicate pending sanctification. No one lingered. No one counted aloud. The numbers would be finalized later, adjusted to fit acceptable loss ratios. I was stopped 3 blocks from my hab by a patrol. Identification, the sergeant demanded. I handed over my chit with shaking hands. He scanned it, frowning slightly as the slate processed my details. His gaze flicked up to my face, then back down. "You survived the occupation," he said, not a question. "Yes," I replied. He nodded slowly. "That will require review." They took me, not roughly, but firmly, to a temporary processing center set up in what had once been a manufacturing loading hall. The air inside was cold and smelled of disinfectant and burned incense. Rows of folding chairs faced a raised desk where an officer and 2 clerks sat beneath a hastily erected acula. One by one, we were called forward. The questions were not about what we had endured. They were about what we might have become. Did you communicate with the enemy? Did you hear voices not transmitted through authorized channels? Did you experience abnormal dreams? Each answer was recorded meticulously. Hesitation was noted. Emotional responses were flagged. The tone was not accusatory, but suspicious, professional paranoia sharpened by recent failure. When my turn came, I answered carefully, sticking to facts that could be corroborated, omitting anything that might sound like weakness. I did not mention the broadcast that had spoken my name. I did not describe the way fear had rewired my instincts. I did not speak of the silence that now felt louder than screams. The officer listened, expression unreadable. "You understand?" he said at last, "that survival during prolonged enemy occupation can indicate irregularities." "Yes," I said, because that was the correct response. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "For your own safety, and for the safety of the Imperium, further observation may be required." Observation. Another word that pretended to be benign. They released me at dusk with a stamped notice ordering me to report for follow-up audits. The paper was warm from the seal, the ink still faintly glossy. It felt heavier than any weapon I had seen. As I walked home, I passed soldiers burning piles of flayed skin and broken icons, the flames crackling as if offended by what they consumed. A chaplain stood nearby, chanting rites of purification, his voice steady, detached. The smoke rose thick and black, curling into a sky that no longer held invaders, but remembered them. That night, I slept poorly. Every distant sound made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to move with intent. When a transport roared overhead, I pressed myself against the floor instinctively, heart hammering. Liberation had not freed us from fear. It had only removed its most obvious source. The interrogations continued over the following days. Those who answered incorrectly did not return. Those who answered correctly were marked, cleared, with stamps that looked reassuring and meant nothing. The city was declared reclaimed. Production quotas were adjusted. Memorials were scheduled, then quietly scaled back due to resource constraints. The invaders were gone. Their lessons remained. I realized then that liberation in the Imperium is not about healing. It is about control reasserted, narratives stabilized, and liabilities identified. The monsters had taken our bodies and our knights. Our supposed saviors took our trust. And as I lay awake, listening to the hum of restored power grids and the distant murmur of patrols, I understood the final cruelty of it. The enemy had left us broken. The Imperium intended to keep us that way, because broken things are easier to manage. They called it reconstruction. That was the word printed at the top of every notice, every ration adjustment, every revised civic charter. Reconstruction implies repair, a return to something recognizable. What followed was not repair. It was repurposing. The planet was declared reclaimed within a standard week. That declaration echoed from Vox towers and shrine balconies alike, accompanied by bells and gun salutes that sounded obscene against the ruins still smoking in the lower districts. Production schedules resumed. Transit routes were reauthorized. The administratum congratulated itself for decisive action taken under impossible circumstances. Nothing was rebuilt the way it had been. The first change was the schools. They did not reopen. Instead, the buildings were rededicated as shrines, temporary at first, then permanent when no objections were raised. Desks were removed and replaced with pews. Lesson slates were melted down into devotional plaques, etched with warnings about vigilance and purity. Children who might once have learned arithmetic and history were instead taught litanies of endurance and sanctioned silence. The second change was the markets. Open plazas where people once gathered to trade and talk were fenced off and paved over, their centers raised into execution platforms for emergency judicial use. No one asked what emergencies would require so many platforms. The answer arrived eventually, without explanation. The third change was us. Survivors were audited. Not immediately, there was paperwork to complete, casualty figures to adjust. But eventually every name left on the rolls was summoned for review. We were called in small groups, processed through halls that smelled of incense and cold metal, watched by guards who avoided eye contact as if afraid of contagion. They tested us for contamination, physical first, blood samples, neural scans, exposure markers, then spiritual. Priests with augmetic eyes asked questions that sounded like prayers and functioned like traps. Do you dream of the occupation? Do you hear echoes when you pray? Do you feel fear without cause? Every answer was logged, every pause noted. The ones who failed were taken aside gently, reassured quietly, and never seen again. The rest of us were stamped provisionally pure. Provisional is a word that lingers. At night, the city was quieter than it had ever been, even before the invasion. Curfew remained in place, not officially, but culturally. People did not gather. Voices stayed low. Windows remained boarded, not because anyone told us to keep them that way, but because removing the boards felt like inviting attention from something that might still be listening. I could not sleep without hearing the broadcasts. Not the sound itself, but the anticipation of it. My mind replayed the cadence of those nights, the way the city would hold its breath just before the signal cut in. I would wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced I had missed a scream that might mean something important. Sometimes I heard them anyway, faint, distant, not real, or maybe they were. The Imperium erected memorials with astonishing speed. They were clean, symmetrical, inscribed with approved phrases about sacrifice and resilience. Names were listed selectively, heroes, officials, sanctioned martyrs. The rest were summarized in numbers, their absence folded into tidy statistics that could be defended in reports. Population loss acceptable, infrastructure damage manageable, spiritual contamination under review. We were encouraged to attend commemorations. Attendance was not mandatory, but absence was noted. At these gatherings, officials spoke of victory and vigilance, of lessons learned and enemies defeated. They never described what had actually happened. They did not need to. We carried that knowledge in our posture, our silences, the way we flinched at raised voices. I returned to work eventually. The manufacturing floor smelled the same as before, hot metal lubricant, ozone, but the rhythm was wrong, too precise. Overseers watched more closely. Safety lectures included new sections on psychological stability and reporting irregular behavior. Workers disappeared mid-shift sometimes, called away for reassessment and replaced without comment. No one asked questions. As the months passed, I realized the invaders had not merely terrorized us. They had educated us. They taught us how fragile order really was. How easily authority collapsed when confronted with something that did not care about rules. And in response, the Imperium tightened its grip, not out of cruelty but out of reflex. A wounded beast does not loosen its claws. I saw it in the children most clearly. They did not play loudly anymore. Games were quiet, rule-bound, focused on stillness and observation. They drew pictures of armored shapes and dark skies, then burned them quickly when adults noticed. They understood, instinctively, that attention was dangerous. The Night Lords, though no one used that name aloud anymore, were gone. But they had rewritten our instincts. Fear became infrastructure. It shaped how we moved, how we spoke, how we thought. The Imperium built on that foundation eagerly, because fear is efficient. Fear does not require constant enforcement. It polices itself. Years later, when new workers arrived from off-world to replace the dead, they remarked on how disciplined we were. How orderly. How compliant. They did not stay long. Something in the air unsettled them. Something in the way we watched the sky. Many requested transfers. Some vanished into reassignment channels and were never mentioned again. The aftermath did not end because it had nowhere to go. There was no before to return to, no after to reach. Only continuation. Life carried on in a narrower, quieter form, stripped of excess movement and unnecessary hope. The invaders had taught the world how to fear itself. The Imperium ensured we would never forget the lesson. And as I lay awake each night, listening to the hum of restored systems and the distant echo of boots on patrol, I understood the final cruelty of survival. We lived on not as witnesses to what had happened, but as proof that it had worked. The stamp came years later. Not with ceremony, not with bells or banners, just a dull, bureaucratic impact pressed into parchment somewhere far above my head. A seal applied in a room I would never see, by hands that would never touch the soil of this world. With that single motion, our planet was declared stable, productive, and compliant once more. The word compliant appeared everywhere after that, on cargo manifests, on recruitment posters, on the opening lines of revised planetary histories distributed to schools and shrines. It replaced older words like survivor and occupied, scrubbing them away with institutional efficiency. We were no longer a cautionary tale. We were a success case. Population figures were adjusted. That was how they phrased it. Entire HAB stacks that had gone silent were removed from records, their residents reclassified as unrecoverable losses. Birth quotas were recalculated to compensate. Immigration targets set. The math worked out neatly on paper. The gaps were invisible to anyone who had not lived in them. I remember standing in line at the Administratum Annex the day my compliance chit was updated. The building was new, its stone still pale, its aquila carvings sharp-edged and unsmoothed by time. Inside, the air smelled of fresh parchment and machine oil. Servo skulls drifted lazily between counters, their lenses clicking as they verified faces. When my turn came, the clerk barely looked at me. He scanned my identification, frowned briefly at the age discrepancy. Years lost, I suppose, visible only in the lines around my eyes, then stamped the chit with practiced indifference. Planetary status updated, he said. You are cleared for unrestricted labor and travel. Unrestricted. The word felt like a joke with no punchline. I stepped back into the street afterward, blinking in the light. Traffic moved. People talked. Vendors shouted prices. Life, from a distance, had resumed its old shape. Only the details were wrong. Too quiet between sounds, too much space between words, too many people who avoided looking up. I still flinch at shadows, even now. Even knowing the invaders are long gone, my body reacts before my mind. A sudden change in lighting makes my muscles tense. A Vox announcement raises my pulse. Laughter at night, real laughter, sets my teeth on edge because it sounds too much like something else when distorted by memory. I lower my voice instinctively, even when I am alone. Old habits, they say. Trauma, the medici whispered once, when they thought I was not listening. A residual response to prolonged stress exposure. Treatable, in theory. In practice, there were no resources allocated for treatment. Functional survivors did not require repair. We were useful as we were. Sometimes I am asked about the occupation, not directly. Never that. The questions come wrapped in politeness, in curiosity carefully measured not to offend. New officials, off-world inspectors, even younger workers born after the events, those who know only the revised version. Was it really so bad? They ask. I never know how to answer. If I say yes, I am asked why so many of us survived. If I say no, I feel like I am lying to the dead, so I say nothing. Silence, after all, is the most compliant response. The Night Lords, though the name is never spoken officially, do not appear in the records. They are referred to as hostile irregular forces, terror elements, non-compliant aggressors. The specificity of their cruelty is sanded down into something abstract, something easier to digest, but we remember the broadcasts, the selections, the way fear became scheduled. More than that, we remember what came after. We remember how quickly the Imperium moved to reclaim authority, not by comforting us, but by reshaping us. How shrines multiplied where homes had burned. How execution platforms became permanent fixtures, just in case. How children learned to whisper before they learned to shout. The invaders did not rule us forever. They did not need to. They claimed something deeper than territory, something that could not be retaken by force or purged by decree. They claimed our instincts, our reflexes, the quiet calculations we make before every word and movement. They taught us that the Imperium's greatest weakness is not invasion, it is survival. Survival carries memory. Memory resists simplification. And memory makes people unpredictable, So the Imperium did what it always does best. It buried memory under procedure. It turned terror into a footnote, suffering into a statistic, and resilience into a productivity metric. It declared us compliant not because we were healed, but because we functioned again within acceptable parameters. I function, I work, I attend required observances, I recite approved litanies with the correct cadence, I do not scream at night anymore, not out loud. This is my confession, then not of heresy, not of failure, but of truth carefully contained. The Night Lords did not break this world, they revealed it. They showed us how thin the line is between order and terror, and how quickly the Imperium will step over that line to restore control. They taught us that compliance is not safety, it is endurance measured and exploited. Our planet stands, our factories run, our ledgers balance, and somewhere, far from here, another world is being assured that disruption is temporary, that audits are underway, that belief is mandatory. I pray they believe it, because belief buys time. And time, as I learned beneath a screaming sky, is the only mercy the Imperium ever truly offers.